The screams of 180 passengers filled the cabin as both engines exploded at 37,000 feet. Panic consumed everyone aboard Flight 1247, except for Marcus Rivera, a 22-year-old aerospace engineering student who had been quietly reading his fluid dynamics textbook just moments before their world turned upside down. October 12, 2024, began as an ordinary Friday morning for Marcus Rivera, a senior at MIT studying aerospace engineering with a focus on propulsion systems. He was flying from Boston Logan International Airport to Seattle Tacoma International on United Flight 1247, a Boeing 737 MAX 8, heading home for his younger sister's wedding. What should have been a routine 5-hour flight would instead become one of the most extraordinary emergency landings in commercial aviation history. Marcus had always been fascinated by aircraft. Growing up in a working-class family in East Los Angeles, he'd spent countless hours at LAX, watching planes take off and land, dreaming of one day designing the engines that powered them. His father, a mechanic at a local auto shop, had instilled in him a deep understanding of mechanical systems, while his mother, a high school math teacher, nurtured his analytical mind. At MIT, Marcus had earned a reputation as a brilliant student with an intuitive understanding of complex aerodynamic principles. His professors often remarked that he could visualize airflow patterns and engine dynamics in ways that typically took years of experience to develop. He'd logged hundreds of hours in flight simulators, not for pilot training, but to better understand how theoretical engineering concepts translated into real-world flight operations. Flight 1247 had departed Boston at 10:15 a.m. with 178 passengers and 6 crew members aboard. Captain Jennifer Walsh, a 20-year veteran with over 15,000 flight hours, and First Officer David Chin, a former Air Force pilot with 8 years of commercial experience, were at the controls. The weather was perfect, clear skies and light winds, promising a smooth flight to Seattle. Marcus had chosen a window seat in row 23, settling in with his advanced fluid dynamics textbook and a stack of research papers on next-generation jet propulsion systems. As an engineering student, he found commercial flights to be perfect laboratories for observing the principles he studied in action. He would often spend flights mentally calculating thrust-to-weight ratios, analyzing wing flex patterns, and listening to the subtle changes in engine sound that indicated different phases of flight. The first 3 hours of the flight proceeded normally. Marcus had dozed off briefly after lunch, his textbook open on his lap, when a sound that would haunt his dreams forever shattered the peaceful cabin atmosphere. Boom. The explosion from the left engine was so violent that it shook the entire aircraft. Marcus's eyes snapped open just as screams erupted throughout the cabin. Through his window, he could see flames streaming from the left engine, with pieces of metal debris falling away into the clouds below. Before anyone could process what had happened, a second explosion rocked the aircraft. Boom. The right engine had also failed, sending more flames and debris streaming behind the aircraft. In the span of 30 seconds, Flight 1247 had gone from a routine commercial flight to a powerless glider at 37,000 feet above the Rocky Mountains. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain," came Captain Walsh's strained voice over the intercom, fighting to maintain composure. "We've experienced a dual-engine failure. We are declaring an emergency and beginning an immediate descent. Please remain calm and listen to your flight attendant's instructions." But calm was the last thing anyone felt. Passengers began screaming, crying, and praying as the aircraft started a steep descent. Flight attendants, trained for emergencies but never having experienced a complete power loss, struggled to maintain order while fighting their own terror. Marcus, however, felt a strange sense of clarity wash over him. Years of studying aerospace engineering had prepared him for this moment in ways he never could have imagined. While others panicked, his mind immediately began analyzing the situation with clinical precision. He knew that a Boeing 737 MAX 8 could glide approximately 100 nautical miles from 37,000 feet under optimal conditions. He calculated wind patterns, potential landing sites, and the aircraft's current glide ratio. Most importantly, he understood something that most passengers didn't. They weren't necessarily going to die, but the pilots would need every advantage they could get. Rising from his seat despite the flight attendant's instructions to remain seated, Marcus made his way toward the front of the aircraft. The cabin was in chaos. People were hyperventilating, some had fainted, and others were frantically calling loved ones on their phones. "Excuse me," Marcus called to senior flight attendant Lisa Park as she struggled to calm a group of panicking passengers. "I need to speak with the pilots immediately." "Sir, you need to return to your seat, Anne." "Ma'am, I'm an aerospace engineering student at MIT specializing in propulsion systems." I may be able to help them troubleshoot the engines or provide technical assistance. Please. Lisa Park looked at this young man with intense brown eyes and an aura of calm that stood in stark contrast to the chaos around them. Something in his voice, a confidence and knowledge that seemed well beyond his years, convinced her to make an unprecedented decision. "Follow me," she said, leading him toward the cockpit. In the cockpit, Captain Walsh and First Officer Chen were running through every emergency checklist they had ever trained for. Both engines had suffered what appeared to be uncontained failures, catastrophic breakdowns where engine components had breached the engine casing and caused secondary damage to aircraft systems. "Captain," Lisa Park called through the reinforced cockpit door. "There's a passenger here who says he's an aerospace engineer. He wants to help." Under normal circumstances, no passenger would ever be allowed into the cockpit during flight. But these weren't normal circumstances. With both engines failed and the aircraft descending through 25,000 feet, Captain Walsh was willing to try anything. "Let him in," she called back. Marcus entered the cockpit and was immediately struck by the professionalism of the two pilots. Despite facing every pilot's worst nightmare, they were working through their procedures with methodical precision. "What's your background?" Captain Walsh asked without taking her eyes off the instruments. "Marcus Rivera, MIT Aerospace Engineering, 4th year. I specialize in turbofan propulsion systems and have extensive simulator experience. What's the status of your auxiliary power unit and hydraulic systems?" First Officer Chen looked up in surprise. This kid was asking the right questions. "APU is online and functioning," Chen reported. "We have partial hydraulic pressure from the electric backup pumps, but we've lost both primary hydraulic systems. Flight controls are responding but they're sluggish." Marcus quickly assessed the situation. The aircraft was descending through 22,000 feet, losing altitude at approximately 2,500 feet per minute. At this rate, they had maybe 8 minutes before they'd be forced to attempt a landing somewhere. "What about engine restart procedures?" Marcus asked. "Have you attempted a windmill restart?" "We tried," Captain Walsh replied grimly. "No response from either engine. The damage appears to be too extensive." Marcus moved to the side window and peered back at the engines. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Both engines had suffered catastrophic failures with significant structural damage visible. Restart was impossible. "Captain, based on your current glide ratio and wind conditions, what's our best landing option?" Marcus asked, his mind racing through calculations. "We're looking at Denver International, but it's going to be close," Chen replied. "We might not have enough altitude." Marcus pulled out his phone and quickly opened a flight tracking app he used for his engineering studies. He calculated their current position, altitude loss rate, and distance to various airports. "What about Colorado Springs?" "Peterson Air Force Base has a 13,000-foot runway, and it's about 15 miles closer than Dien," Marcus suggested. Captain Walsh and First Officer Chen exchanged glances. This young man was thinking like a pilot, not just a passenger. "Contact approach control," Walsh decided. "See if Peterson can accommodate us." As First Officer Chen worked the radios, Marcus continued to assist by monitoring instruments and calling out altitude and airspeed readings. His understanding of aerodynamics proved invaluable as he helped the pilots optimize their glide path. "Peterson approach, United 1247 Heavy, dual engine failure, 180 souls on board, requesting emergency landing," Chen transmitted. The response was immediate. "United 1247, Peterson approach, cleared for emergency landing runway 17 to 35. All emergency services are standing by." With their destination set, the real challenge began. Landing a powerless commercial airliner requires precise energy management. Too fast and they'd overshoot the runway, too slow and they'd fall short. There would be no second chances. "Marcus," Captain Walsh said, "I need you to help me calculate our approach speed. What's the optimal glide speed for our current weight?" Using his phone's calculator and his knowledge of Boeing's 737 performance characteristics, Marcus quickly computed the numbers. "Based on estimated fuel burn and passenger load, I calculate about 185,000 pounds. Optimal glide speed should be around 190 knots indicated airspeed." As they descended through 15,000 feet, Marcus could see the Colorado landscape rushing toward them. The Rocky Mountains stretched in every direction, making their approach path critical. One wrong calculation could send them into a mountainside. 10,000 feet, Marcus called out, reading the altimeter. "We're on profile for Peterson." The aircraft was handling surprisingly well considering the circumstances. The pilot's skill, combined with the Boeing 737's inherently stable design, was keeping them in controlled flight despite the loss of both engines. At 8,000 feet they could see Peterson Air Force Base ahead. The runway looked impossibly small from their altitude, but Marcus knew it was more than adequate for a 737 if they could reach it. "Marcus, I need you to go back to the cabin and help prepare the passengers for emergency landing," Captain Walsh instructed. "Make sure they understand the brace position and that evacuation will be immediate upon landing." Marcus nodded and headed back to the passenger cabin, which was still in a state of controlled panic. Flight attendants were doing their best to prepare everyone, but many passengers were still in shock. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus called out in a strong, confident voice that somehow cut through the chaos. "My name is Marcus Rivera. I'm an aerospace engineering student, and I've been working with your pilots for the last 15 minutes. We are going to land safely at Peterson Air Force Base in about 6 minutes." The cabin fell silent as passengers focused on this young man who spoke with such certainty. "I want everyone to listen carefully," Marcus continued. "The pilots are doing an incredible job, and this aircraft is designed to handle exactly this type of emergency. When we land it's going to be fast and hard, but the aircraft can handle it. Follow your flight attendant's instructions exactly, assume the brace position when instructed, and be ready to evacuate quickly." His words had an almost magical effect on the panicked passengers. Here was someone who understood what was happening, someone who had been in the cockpit with the pilots, telling them they were going to survive. The screaming stopped, replaced by focused attention on the flight attendants' safety demonstrations. Marcus returned to the cockpit for the final approach. They were now at 5,000 feet, lined up with Peterson's runway 17 to 35. The landing would have to be perfect, they'd get only one chance. 3,000 feet, Marcus called out, continuing his role as an additional crew member. "Speed 195 knots on glide path." 2,000 feet. "Speed 190 knots. Looking good." At 1,000 feet, Captain Walsh began the final phase of the approach. Without engine power she couldn't add thrust if they came up short, and without normal hydraulic pressure, the flight controls required significantly more physical effort to operate. 500 feet, Marcus announced, his voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. "Speed 185 knots. The runway was rushing toward them now. Marcus could see fire trucks and ambulances lined up along the taxiways, ready for the worst-case scenario. 100 feet, he called out. "Speed 180 knots. What happened next would be talked about in aviation circles for decades. Captain Walsh executed a flawless landing, touching down smoothly despite having no engine power and limited hydraulic assistance. The aircraft rolled down the runway as thrust reversers deployed automatically and Captain Walsh applied maximum braking. They came to a stop with over 2,000 feet of runway remaining. For a moment, the cockpit was silent except for the sound of emergency vehicles approaching. Then First Officer Chin began laughing, not from hysteria, but from pure relief and amazement at what they had just accomplished. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Walsh announced over the intercom, her voice now steady and professional, "welcome to Colorado Springs. Please remain seated while emergency crews inspect the aircraft, then we'll begin evacuation procedures." The evacuation was textbook perfect. All 180 passengers and 6 crew members were off the aircraft within 90 seconds, sliding down the emergency chutes onto the tarmac where medical personnel waited to assess everyone for injuries. Remarkably, there were no serious injuries, just some minor cuts and bruises from the evacuation slides. Marcus was one of the last to leave the aircraft, having stayed to help ensure all passengers evacuated safely. As he reached the bottom of the slide, he was immediately surrounded by news crews who had arrived on scene, as well as National Transportation Safety Board investigators who would spend the next year determining exactly what had caused the dual-engine failure. The investigation would later reveal that a manufacturing defect in the engine fan blades had caused the initial failure of the left engine. Debris from that failure had then been ingested by the right engine, causing it to fail as well, an incredibly rare occurrence that had happened only a handful of times in commercial aviation history. But the real story wasn't the mechanical failure, it was how a 22-year-old college student had stepped up in humanity's darkest hour and helped save 186 lives through his knowledge, composure, and willingness to act when others were paralyzed by fear. The recognition came swiftly. President Biden called Marcus personally to thank him for his heroism. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum requested his textbook, the one he'd been reading when disaster struck, for a permanent exhibit on aviation heroes. United Airlines offered Marcus a full scholarship to complete his degree and a guaranteed position in their engineering department upon graduation. Boeing invited him to participate in their advanced research programs, recognizing that his quick thinking and theoretical knowledge had practical applications they wanted to harness. But perhaps most meaningful to Marcus was the letter he received from Captain Walsh. "Marcus, in 20 years of flying, I've never encountered a situation where a passenger contributed so significantly to the safety of the flight. Your knowledge, calm demeanor, and willingness to help when we needed it most exemplify the very best of human nature. You didn't just help us land that airplane, you helped us save 186 lives." The Federal Aviation Administration used the incident to implement new protocols for utilizing qualified passengers during emergencies. While strict security procedures prevent unauthorized cockpit access under normal circumstances, new guidelines now allow flight crews to request assistance from passengers with relevant technical expertise during genuine emergencies. Marcus returned to MIT as something of a celebrity, but he remained focused on his studies and his ultimate goal of designing safer, more reliable aircraft engines. The experience had given him insights into real-world aviation that no textbook could provide. "I just did what my education prepared me to do," Marcus often said when asked about that day. "My professors at MIT, my parents who taught me to think analytically and act decisively, and all the flight simulator hours I'd logged, everything came together when it mattered most." His younger sister's wedding, delayed by a week due to the incident, became a celebration not just of her marriage but of her brother's heroism. Marcus walked her down the aisle with a quiet pride, knowing that his actions had allowed him to be there for one of the most important days of her life. Today, Marcus Rivera is completing his master's degree in aerospace engineering at MIT, specializing in engine reliability and failure analysis. His thesis, Dual Engine Failure Scenarios, Mechanical Causes and Human Factors in Emergency Response, has been praised by industry experts as groundbreaking research that could prevent future tragedies. The passengers of Flight 1247 stay in touch through social media, forming a bond that only shared survival can create. They call themselves Marcus's Miracles, and several have started scholarship funds to help other underprivileged students pursue aerospace engineering degrees. Captain Walsh retired from United Airlines 6 months after the incident, but not before personally training a new generation of pilots in advanced emergency procedures that incorporate lessons learned from Flight 1247. First Officer Chin was promoted to captain and specifically requested to fly the Boeing 737 MAX fleet, saying he wanted to help restore public confidence in the aircraft. The aircraft itself, United Flight 1247's Boeing 737 MAX 8, was eventually repaired and returned to service after extensive testing and modifications. It now carries a small plaque in the cockpit commemorating the events of October 12, 2024, and the young man whose knowledge and courage helped bring everyone home safely. For Marcus Rivera, that terrifying day at 37,000 feet became the defining moment that shaped not just his career, but his understanding of how theoretical knowledge can have life-and-death applications. He learned that engineering isn't just about designing better machines, it's about understanding how those machines interact with human beings in crisis situations. Engineering school teaches you to solve problems, Marcus reflects. But that day taught me that sometimes the most important problems you'll solve won't be on a test or in a laboratory. They'll be when people are counting on you to use everything you've learned to help them survive. As Flight 1247 proved, sometimes heroes don't wear capes or uniforms. Sometimes they're just 22-year-old college students with textbooks in their hands and the courage to step up when the impossible becomes possible at 37,000 feet.